Yeah.
Okay, we can start. So good evening to everyone who's tuned in. Today we're going to be speaking about the theme of the Forest Conservation Amendment Act 2023, Death's Knell. So we are joined by our esteemed speaker, Dr. Amita Punj. Please allow me to introduce her to you. So Dr. Amita Punj is a law and development scholar currently associated with the National Law University, Delhi. She also heads the Center of Law, Justice and Development at NLU Delhi, which focuses on capacity building, empirical research, and policy interventions with the aim that legal and development discourses are better informed by justice. Her work as an academic resides at the interface of law development, especially focusing on theoretical aspects of law and development and concerns pertaining to gender, justice, human rights, and marginalization. She has been a recipient of the British Evening and VEWA fellowships for studying in the UK and for teaching and research in the Europe, respectively. For the past 12 years, she has also been collaborating with the University of Antwerp in facilitating their LLM course on sustainable development and global justice. A very, very warm welcome to you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Tia.
Lovely to have you here. So to start off with, in what ways do you, according to your observations, does this act shift the focus from conserving forests to exploiting them for economic and developmental purposes?
I think I would like to start answering your question by drawing your attention to one of the facts of law. And as life, law also resides at the interface of contradictions. So when we are talking about conservation, we're not talking about conservation in vacuum. We're obviously talking about conservation which can happen side by side along with exploitation or utilization of resources. So we're anyways located at the interface of conservation on one hand and exploitation or utilization on the other hand. So then that's in order to deal with those contradictions and to balance out these contradictions, a particular approach was adopted by the Forest Conservation Act 1980. So when I talk about exploitation or conservation and the position of law under Forest Conservation Amendment Act, I'm obviously talking about it in the context of the position that it held under the FCA. So having said that, I think what we need to start off with is the idea of conservation itself. And as far as my position with respect to the Forest Conservation Amendment Act, that it is more tuned to exploitation rather than conservation, is coming from the idea that conservation, the way it defines conservation, actually entails in itself exploitation of forests. Secondly, what it does is, obviously, when you're talking about forest conservation, you're essentially dealing with forests and avoidance of diversion of forest for non-forest purposes. So definitely you will be dealing with what you identify as forest and what you identify as non-forest purposes. In that regard, the Forest Conservation Act 1980 did not define what a forest is. As against that, the Amendment Act does define what a forest is, and it defines it in a restrictive way to against the kind of understanding of forest that prevailed before 2023, and it also restrictively defines the term non-forest purpose. So in that sense, it opens up wide arena for exploitation, whereas constricts the arena where Conservation Act would apply. Having said that, I would also like to add other ways in which the Amendment Act actually tries to undo or is more exploitative as against or promotes exploitation as against Forest Conservation Act 1980. And that is also by having so many exclusions from the applicability provision. So it is not applicable to many areas which are forest lands, but they are excluded from the applicability of Forest Conservation Amendment Act. And the worst part is not that it does what it does, but it does that under the garb of actually not only conserving forest, but further regenerating and augmenting forest, as the name indicates. So not only that, the balance has tilted in favor of exploitation, greater utilization of forest, and imagining forest as an economic resource. Not only that, but also projecting it as if it is actually trying to conserve and regenerate forest. Whereas, so in that sense, that change in the name is only symbolic.
Right.
It is to probably reinforce that we can have the cake and eat it too. We can continue eating the cake, but we'll continue to have the cake, right? So in that sense, what Shakespeare said, that what is there in a name, I think there's a lot in the name, because the name makes us believe certain things. So that probably the law is regarding conversation, it aims at augmenting forests. So the name pulls us in one direction, whereas the substantive provisions of the law pull us in another direction. So that is where the problem is.
Right. So thank you for laying down the basics of the act for us. So how does this act aim to redefine the concept of non-forest purpose, and what are the consequences of this redefinition?
So as far as I mentioned to you with regard to the earlier question that you raised, that for the idea of non-forest purpose is quite crucial to the forest conservation law, because what non-forest purpose is, the act will apply on that. So definitely that is crucial. Secondly, there's a particular approach that law adopts with regard to defining, and it's not with respect to law, but the possibility of defining anything. So there are two ways in which one may define. One may define something by enumerating or identifying certain constituents of what you're defining. And the other way, which is generally used in conjunction with this way, is to differentiate it from what it is not. So the basic approach that was adopted by Forest Conservation Act with regard to defining non-forest purpose is by saying that all purposes which are not afforestation are non-forest purposes. Broadly, it takes that position. And Forest Conservation Amendment Act also takes that position. So in that sense, it is retaining that way of defining what non-forest purpose is. However, there's another part to what non-forest purpose is. So non-forest purpose in FCA is defined under, it's explained in an explanation to the provision to section 2 of the Forest Conservation Act. And what it does is to divide or make us think about forest, non-forest purpose in exclusion to what is required with regards to maintenance, conservation, and development of forest itself. So, because there would be some activities beyond reforestation which would be required to conserve, develop, and maintain forests. So, it then excludes those activities from the general definition of non-forest purpose that it adopts, that every purpose beyond reforestation is non-forest purpose. And it is very crucial to understand what it is doing, because implications are grave. However, the way it is happening may not draw everyone's attention to the fact that this is what is happening. So a legal reading of the provision enables us to do that. So just to explain to you, this definition or this exclusion actually can be read in three parts. First part defines the nature of activities. What are the nature of activities? So activities that pertain to development, conservation, and maintenance of forest. Second part of this explanation, which actually is accepting certain purposes from the definition of non-forest purposes, which are then makes it appear that they are forest purposes, is to enumerate specific activities. And the third part is any other like purpose, which then is actually including certain other activities. So there are these three portions. The Amendment Act does not introduce any change in the first portion and the last portion. Whereas it introduces changes in the middle portion where specific activities are identified. Say, for example, there are activities like benchmarks, water pipelines, wireless communication, whatever is required for the maintenance, development, and conservation of forest itself. So these purposes, these activities are specific activities which have been enumerated in the Forest Conservation Act, which are geared towards development of forest. So the end result is development, the purpose is development of forest. However, what the Amendment Act does is to expand this enumeration that is happening in the middle portion of the definition of non-forest purpose, exclusion that is happening. And while enumerating, it includes zoos, it includes safaris, it includes ecotourism, it includes silviculture, and therefore expands this category. Now, this expansion is not limited to what is enumerated in the legislation. Why? Because so one might feel that these are the other activities that are included, and therefore they would not amount to non-forest use. That means they are forest use. The Forest Conservation Act, in terms of excluding or avoiding putting forest to non-forest purpose, that is not happening because it is forest purpose. So one is to think about zoos, safaris, and ecotourism as forest purpose. So first point is that from the notion of conservation, development, and maintenance of forest, for the development of forest itself, we have moved to a position where we are talking about development through forests. We are reducing forest to an instrumentality of development seen as economic growth. Whereas earlier, we were only saying that forest, non-forest purpose does not include those purposes which are to be entered into for the development of forest itself. Now we are saying certain other purposes which are not for the purposes of development of forest, but for using forest for development in general, they are also included as forest purposes. So one is that problem. The second problem that happens, which is not immediately apparent, is on account of certain rules of interpretation that are applicable in this kind of a situation. So legally speaking, when certain items are enumerated in any provision, and these items together constitute a category, followed by certain words which are general in nature. So we have specific words which constitute a category, followed by general words like other purposes, other activities, like activities, like purposes. So these are general words followed by specific words. And where these specific words constitute a category, then the interpretation of the general words is restricted to that category. It can't go beyond this category. And when we say it can't go beyond this category, that means only for purposes that are to be adopted for development of forests themselves. So that is a limitation that existed in Forest Conservation Act 1980. However, under Forest Conservation Amendment Act, what has happened that this category has broken down. Now there is no single category under which we can categorize all these activities because they are diverse in nature. They are not limited to development of forest, but they include development, forest for development, the idea of forest for development. And therefore, this rule of adjustum generis, which restricts the interpretation of the following general words to the genus or the category that is constituted by these specific words, becomes inapplicable. And when it becomes inapplicable, what constitutes forest purpose is not limited to, say, silviculture or zoos or safaris or ecotourism that is enumerated specifically, but also lays down a path for inclusion of many other activities which are not actually forest purposes. So in this way, it is kind of expanding the definition of forest purpose by shrinking the definition of non-forest purpose. And that is where the problem lies. Further, with respect to zoos and safaris, it says that where zoos or safaris are going to be established except in protected areas. So there are certain protected areas that exist, that are identified. Whereas this restriction is not there with respect to ecotourism.
Mhm.
So
Right.
ecotourism may happen in protected areas. So the broader point that I'm trying to make is that through the use of drafting techniques and the wording of the legislature, a lot is happening, and the implications of that are going to be grave as far as conservation of forest is concerned. That's a broader point that I would like to make.
Absolutely. Very, very well put, I must say, Professor. And do you think this idea of viewing conservation of the forest strictly for instrumental or functional purposes that it serves to humans has is reminiscent of a colonial hangover in some terms, where we're stepping back, or are there other factors to it?
So I would not say attribute it only to colonialism, because
Right.
we've continued with the existing forest regime much beyond the end of colonial era. So it
Mm-hmm.
is only that in 1980s we started talking about forest conservation.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, we were also led by this idea of development as economic growth. We were
Mm-hmm.
geared towards that, and therefore there is huge tension between, and so there is this contradiction amidst which forest laws exist. The tension between forest as a resource, as an economic resource, and therefore something to be utilized or exploited, and forest as a pristine um, ecosystem which should be preserved, also for the fact that there's no planet B.
Right.
So it has existed. Definitely, the roots of it go back to the colonial era, but I would not attribute in its entirety the entire burden on the colonial powers, because we have continued it. So we
Sure.
also bear some responsibility and accountability in that regard.
Sure. And following up to that question, I'd also like to ask if you think that development and anthropocentrism are actually, antagonistic to each other, and antagonistic to the whole idea of um, conservation. Um, do you think that the two can never coexist?
So, as I said to begin with, that law, like life, resides at the interface of contradictions. So, there
Right.
is this contradiction that being part of humankind, we are anthropocentric. We think about conservation only in ways which are anthropocentric in nature. So, we are into this anthropocentric era. However, I think as conscious beings, as self reflective beings, as beings who have the capacity to critically assess their own positions, I think we'll be in a better sense anthropocentric if we still think about forest conservation and not reduce
Absolutely.
forests to mere economic resources. So we don't, I'm not saying so. There is a problem with anthropocentrism, no doubt. However, while being anthropocentric, still we can ensure that our efforts are geared towards conservation, and we take conscious decision and
Mhm.
say no to ourselves.
Mhm,
Right?
mhm.
As Gandhi said, that Mother Earth has enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. So, and it is upon us, and their greed has got promoted through
Right,
certain political economic structures that we operate in. So when
right.
these economic structures exist, and there is mad rush for production, overproduction, etc., this overproduction is not resulting in satisfying needs of everyone. We know that there's huge inequality that prevails. So in that sense, I think we need to really reimagine how we think about our existence on this planet Earth, and therefore take a conscious decision of just saying no to ourselves.
Okay. Uh, how does the FCA conflict with or fail to align with existing laws? and principles related to forest conservation and community rights? And further, does the FCA handle the concept of improvement of livelihoods for the forest development, the dependent communities like the scheduled tribes and the forest dwellers? And why is that seen as problematic?
Yeah, so I think we need to think about forest conservation and the way forest conservation is tried to be promoted through FCA and then through the Amendment Act in the context of all the other laws that exist. So, one of the other laws that exists is the Forest Rights Act. It was enacted in 2006 and it recognized rights of forest dwelling scheduled tribes and other forest dwellers, other traditional forest dwellers. It recognized, not only it recognized their rights, but it recognized their rights in the context where it also recognized that there have been historical injustices that have been perpetrated against these communities. And it also recognized that these communities are integral to survival and sustenance of forests. So in that sense, they did not view these forest dwellers as the other to the forest, so exploiters of forest, but as those who exist together or as part of the forest itself, and therefore
Right.
and have been traditionally playing major role in conservation of forests through their different ways. And that, I think, is completely forgotten in the Forest Conservation Amendment Act. So there's one approach under Forest Rights Act and the other approach taken in the Forest Conservation Act, where to pay lip service to Forest Rights Act and the approach that Forest Rights Act adopts, it says all that in the preamble to the legislation, to the Amendment Act. But legally speaking, preambles cannot be used to restrict or expand the provisions of the law, that is the sections, because preamble is not voted upon in the parliament. Therefore, preamble in that sense is not part of a statute like the statement of objects and reasons. It is just a recital of background or the conditions that necessitate a particular law. So one is that. So all that relating to conservation, net zero emission, and carbon sinks to be provided, livelihood of forest dwelling communities, and cultural and traditional values pertaining to forest, etc. All those aspects have been enumerated in the preamble, but none of them show up in the substantive provisions of the law. So in
Right.
that sense, they are only relegated to the background, not brought to the forefront and delved into or enacted. And therefore, one finds that, despite the fact that the amendment, like the preamble, states that how important is to really, but sustain the traditional value of forest. Still, the value, say, so for example, one of the values that traditional communities hold with regard to forest is their perception that forests are sacred. And we've witnessed that being recognized by the Supreme Court in Orissa Mineral Corporation case, where they said that Niyamgiri Hill is a deity for this forest community. So
Right.
in that sense, they are not viewing. So there is a difference in the worldview that the traditional communities have and others have. And that difference in the worldview is getting reflected. Obviously, it is reflected in their cultures and traditions. Whereas that is not being adopted by the Forest Conservation Amendment Act to take these traditional values further. And we know that it's not just cultural traditions, but there are also historical traditions. We know about the Chipko movement and the role that it played against expropriating forest resources. So it did take a conscious position against expropriation of forest resources, and therefore we can go back to that and look at what kind of popular tradition is rooted in Chipko movement. So, and those are the aspects, or those are the activities or positions that would go on to ensure survival as well as sustainability of forests. So what the Amendment Act does is to not take into account any of these. Nothing of this sort is there in the substantive provisions of the legislation. Further, we also have, in that sense, Forest Rights Act specifically incorporates within itself a specific role that is assigned to Gram Sabhas in regard to diversion of forest for non-forest purposes. And Forest Rights Act has overriding effect over Forest Conservation Act. So because law has to be read as a whole, we need to look at where Forest Conservation Act is positioned as against the Forest Rights Act. So we know that Forest Rights Act has overriding effect over Forest Conservation Act. And it states that basic decisions with regards to diversion of forest for non-forest purposes is going to be done by the Gram Sabha. And that had been happening. There might be issues regarding how it was being operationalized. So there's a lot that has been written, empirical studies have been undertaken to indicate the falsity of all this. However, at least at the normative level, it existed. And therefore, because Forest Rights Act 2006 provided for that, the Forest Conservation Act, the rules under the Forest Conservation Act were changed to incorporate this requirement for taking permission from or approval from the central government to divert forest land to non-forest use. So it existed in the earlier rules, but in 2022, these rules were changed. So before the 23 Amendment Act came in, the rules pertaining to Forest Conservation Act were changed, where this requirement for Gram Sabha approval, free, prior, informed consent of the people living there in the forest land, whose livelihoods are dependent on these forest lands, that had to be taken before any development activity or any infrastructure could be constructed or forest could be diverted to any non-forest use. So that was required to happen. However, now with the change in rules, the requirement for Gram Sabha approval still exists in FRA, but it is not there in the rules pertaining to the Forest Conservation Amendment Act. And therefore, there is some incoherence that needs to be resolved. They're not, it's not that they can't be resolved, but there has to be a spirited effort towards doing that. And therefore, one needs to be conscious of the kinds of incoherences that exist between Forest Rights Act and the Forest Conservation Amendment Act. And as far as livelihoods of forest dwellers is concerned, again, it is mentioned in the preamble to the Amendment Act. Nowhere else is it mentioned. I was going through the Joint Parliamentary Committee that was constituted to look into this bill before it got passed by both the houses of Parliament. And some of the stakeholders did raise this issue as to there is nothing in the substantive provisions to provide for livelihood of the forest dwelling communities. The response of the ministry was that there is this provision at the end of the Forest Conservation Amendment Act, which allows central governments to take initiatives and make rules or issue notifications for the implementation of the provisions of the Act. And therefore, we would imagine that it stands delegated to the central government to do all this. However, there's a rider here. And the rider is, so that's the position of the Joint Parliamentary Committee. That's the position that ministry took in the Joint Parliamentary Committee meetings. However, the point here is that central government would make rules for better implementation of the Act. Livelihood and maintaining and furthering the livelihood of forest dwelling communities does not occur in the provisions of the Act. It only occurs in the recital of background conditions in the form of the preamble. So the central government may not do anything with regard to that.
Right. So it's not legally enforceable.
Yeah, legally enforceable in terms of like, being able to ask or mandate or fix accountability on the part of the central government that you haven't done anything with regard to enforcement of this provision of ensuring livelihood of forest dwelling communities. And at the same time, you're taking away from them the right to stall a diversion of forest for non-forest purposes. Because now the approval of Gram Sabha is not required under the Forest Conservation Act. But when one reads the two legislations together, one can argue that it's still required because Forest Rights Act has overriding effect over the Forest Conservation Act.
Right. So overall, we can see a shift in the people's participation, and the expansion has actually added more ambiguities to what we deem as conservation and what we deem as development. So could you also shed some light on the exclusions of certain types of forest lands from the FCA? And what is its impact on the sustenance of the prevailing forest cover in India?
Yeah, so, and this is a major shift because Forest Conservation Act 1980 did not exclude any forested area from the purview of the Forest Conservation Act. But the legislation, the Amendment Act of 23 expressly excludes certain forests from the applicability of this law. And it has far-reaching implications. So just to understand that, one, it excludes, say, 100 kilometers from the international border. All the forests that are there within a range of 100 kilometers from the international border or the line of control, they shall be provided some security related activities undertaken and forest is cut for that purpose. That would not be included within this legislation. Forest Conservation Act will not apply. Second is so this is exclusion on the ground of location. The other is exclusion on the ground of security related reasons where you say infrastructure needs to be created. Security related infrastructure needs to be created. It doesn't specify the territory. The first specifies the territory in terms of location. The other one does not specify territory, but it specifies what the purpose could be. The third exclusion, and both these exclusions, the forest, the use of or diversion of forest for these purposes is to happen within a particular territorial area, that is 100 kilometers from the line of control, or say 10 hectares from from somewhere, right? So if infrastructure or security related infrastructure is going to be created within 10 hectares, not beyond that. So there are limits to which you can put forest to non-forest use, whether it is on account of security, etc., and within a limited area. So there is limitation with respect to the area that is to be excluded from the provision of this act. If you go beyond that area, then that is not excluded and that would fall within the Forest Conservation Amendment Act. However, there is this third category. The third category consists of diversion of forest for establishing paramilitary camps, for defense related projects, or for public utility. Now, unlike the other two exclusions, this exclusion does not start with the territorial limits up to which this ought to be done. But it limits only those public utility projects or paramilitary camps, etc., the establishment of that in left-wing extremism affected areas. So only in those areas that if you establish public utility or if you establish paramilitary camp or if you establish some defense related project, then there is a limit of 5 hectares, but only in left-wing extremism affected areas, not in other forested areas. So what we find is that, one, these exclusions did not exist earlier. Now these exclusions are there. Not only that these exclusions are there, but at times there are some limits to these exclusions. At times there are no limits to these exclusions in terms of the extent of forest that you can destroy for these purposes. And third, and the most important part of it, is that not only that it says that public utility service may be public utility, the forest may be put to public utility use, or a defense related project. It does not even define these terms. It does not define left-wing extremism affected areas. It does not define. And therefore, anything or everything could be public utility. We don't know whether defense related project could be, so you want to establish a cinema hall for the soldiers, whether that will also be projected as defense related project. So there are many possibilities that can be explored, and there are many activities in the garb of which you are allowed to put forest, cut down forest without defining them. Fourth, and the most important, is that you may do that. Okay, so you may say that there is a reasonable argument to better protect our borders and allow defense related infrastructure to be set up. Definitely, that's a valid and a legitimate public purpose. However, because these areas have been excluded from the applicability of the Forest Conservation Amendment Act, the forest conservation rules also don't apply, because they're excluded. Rules apply only to those areas or to that land to which the act applies, because rules operate under the legislation. So when you exclude something from the legislation, they automatically get excluded from the rules. And what happens when they get excluded from the rules is that the rules provide for compensatory afforestation. So the system or the mechanism that Forest Conservation Act established in 1980 was to say that broadly, forests ought not to be diverted for non-forest use. But if they are diverted, then there are these rules which require the agency that is diverting forest for non-forest use to actually undertake compensatory afforestation. So you destroy forest in one area, but compensate it through afforestation in another area. So in that sense, the broader forest cover is retained. What is happening here through exclusions is that you're excluding certain areas from the applicability of the act, and therefore they are automatically getting excluded from the mandate of afforestation. And therefore, there is no requirement to undertake afforestation, provided you are using these identified excluded areas for the purposes identified under the act, which are then excluded from the legislation. And therefore, in that sense, that marks a great shift in the approach towards forest conservation in India. Because under the earlier act, you could do this. You could do this with the prior approval of the central government, but then also compensate through afforestation. Now, afforestation is not required. So then obviously it will lead to dwindling of forest cover. As it is, it is going to lead to dwindling of forest cover because of the kind of definition that Forest Conservation Amendment Act has adopted. And it does not recognize many forested areas in India as forest now. So forests are only those that are identified as forest in Section 1A that has been introduced into the Forest Conservation Act, which is forest recorded or notified as forest under the Indian Forest Act 1927, or certain other forests identified. So so afforested areas which have not been notified as forest then are not forest, and therefore they may be utilized for or diverted for non-forest purposes without there being any requirement for compensatory afforestation also.
Right. And to think about it, even compensatory afforestation has its limitations, right? Because you're ultimately destroying an ecosystem and intend to replace it in a different geographical area, and to even dilute that further warrants an alarm, and but there's a need to shift this approach altogether. So,
Yeah.
what are the overarching implications of FCA's amendments for the rule of law and environmental conservation in India? And how do you believe that we can redefine the act to help serve the cause of conservation?
Yeah, so as far as rule of law is concerned, the basic ideas, I mean, a few of the ideas that constitute the idea of rule of law is that law should be coherent, it should be clear. These are, I mean, the two ideas that I have picked up. There are other ideas as well, but in this context, I've picked up these two ideas. Law should be coherent and it should be clear. One is, I already pointed out to you the incoherences between the Forest Rights Act and the Forest Conservation Act, and therefore they need to be specifically reconciled. Also,
Right.
the kind of requirements that exist in Forest Rights Act, but they have been done away with under the forest conservation rules. So these are certain incoherences which ought not to exist, because certainty of law is a value that we really must ensure. So one is that. Second is the kind of arbitrariness that is allowed or enabled by not defining the terms that are being used in the legislation. I pointed that out as well, that public utility is not defined. What could be defense related project is not defined. What is left-wing extremism affected area is not defined. So we are dealing with certain ideas, presuming that there is some understanding about these ideas, but unless this understanding is clear to everyone, all those who are operationalizing this law, we can't achieve the purpose of this law. Therefore, not defining the ideas that are used in the legislation is a grave lacuna. It must be plugged to, in order to ensure that rule of law prevails. Because if law is uncertain, that would actually imply greater discretion or freedom on the part of those who are operationalizing it to operationalize it in the way they understand it. Because legislation doesn't tell us how to understand public utility. What are the contours of public utility? What would constitute security related infrastructure? What would not constitute security related infrastructure? So something like cinema hall may be excluded. So one might expect that the rules under the forest, the new rules that come up to operationalize what has been introduced through the Forest Conservation Amendment Act, one expects that these aspects are taken care of, and it is tried to be ensured that this kind of discretion does not exist.
Right.
Yeah. Also, I think as far as conservation, the idea of conservation is concerned, we have moved a lot away from the idea of conservation to actually enabling exploitation of existing forests, and
Right.
also ensuring that we don't consider forests, they are something else, and therefore they may be diverted from forest and put to non-forest, they may be eliminated. So it has grave implications for conservation. We're not conserving them, we are only enabling exploitation by not recognizing all those forests that have existed as forests. What we are doing is expanding the idea of we're restricting the idea of non-forest purpose. So every purpose, whether it is for the forest or through the forest, is a forest purpose. So then
Right.
the Conservation Act does not apply. So in that sense, it has grave implications for conservation of forests in India. And therefore, I think what we need to do is first have the spirit of conservation with which we work. So we need to be clear and convinced about the fact that we need to conserve these resources and not exploit them the way we've been exploiting them. And therefore, that spirit needs to be incorporated in the law. We need to work out that spirit through the law that we have, whereas the Amendment Act does not do that.
Right. So any law would remain a mere law unless we develop that spirit of conservation in our every approach towards the environment. Thank you for beautifully putting that. And also, ultimately, it would also impact vulnerable communities, their livelihoods, and the erasures of conservation traditions that have been there in the country for centuries. So I think with that, we can call it a wrap to today's conversation. Thank you so much, Professor, for all your wonderful insights. I'd also like to take out this time to let the audience know that they can access Professor's article that's available on the EPW website. And also take a moment to request people to just subscribe to us, to support us on social media. Thank you once again, Professor, and thank you to everyone who's tuned in patiently.
Thank you very much, Tia. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you. It was a pleasure being here.
Lovely to have you.